Barenaked, Barenaked, ABCs. Welcome to the Barenaked ABCs, and this week we will not be reviewing one particular song. We have a special episode this week as we are pushing our next song off by 1 week. And speaking of 1 week, we are very fortunate today to be talking with the person who produced the band's most profitable hit, as well as their most profitable album, an album that is near and dear to my heart. I am, of course, talking about Stunt. I am so glad to be talking with her during this 20th anniversary year. Not only was she one of the few women producers, engineers, mixers, and audio electronic technicians at a time when it was unheard of, but also one of the best in general, indeterminate of all of that. Long before the Barenaked Ladies, she began her career by working on 5 Prince albums, including starting with easily his most famous album, I think, Purple Rain, an album that ranked number 6 on the Rolling Stones' top 500 albums of all time. With so many hit songs on that album, I don't know where to even start, but to give a few: Purple Rain, Let's Go Crazy, I Would Die For You, Take Me With You, and to bring us back to Barenaked Ladies, a song that deeply influenced them enough that it was a part of their early career and their early live shows. And we'll discuss this 4 years from now when we actually reach it alphabetically. They recorded it as part of the radio show contest, When Doves Cry. She was also a producer for David Byrne from Talking Heads and another band that keeps popping up on our podcast, The Odds, who, as you guys may remember, have been backing Steven on his last couple of solo albums. And their leader, Craig Northey, joined Steven on his last tour and on this next upcoming tour. On Discogs.com, she is listed on over 150 different albums and singles in some way, shape, or another. India R.E., The Jacksons, Rusted Root, Toad the Red Sprocket. I'm going to mess this name up. Gigita. Did I get it right?
Gigita.
Okay. Thank you for the correction. I always mess up someone. And Tricky. But that 20 years was just the first part of her career, because afterwards she left producing to go get her doctorate from McGill University in Montreal and is now a professor of music production and engineering. Her research focuses on auditory memory, the perception of musical signals, and the influence of musical training on auditory development. She is the director of the Berklee Music Perception and Cognition Laboratory. She teaches music production, music theory, and a number of other classes. Personally, as a past psychology major myself, I would love to spend hours talking to her about all the different things with music and cognition, but we don't have that much time. So, but if that weren't enough, she and a former student, Matthew MacArthur, launched Boston's first nonprofit recording studio, The Record Company, to offer low-cost recording facilities to area musicians and free music technology instruction to area teens. I could spend the rest of our time just listing her accolades, but I think you would rather hear, and I know I would rather talk with, the woman, the myth, the legend, Susan Rogers. Thank you today for joining us, Susan.
Thank you for having me on your show. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, yeah, we are too.
I know that Aaron's probably geeking out just about as much as I am today. I'm the deep Barenaked Ladies fan. He is the deep music fan in general. So between the two of us, I know that I'm just trying to hold back all my anxiety right now. Aaron is our music geek on the show. Went to college for music specifically. So jazz, is that right?
Well, it's a jazz school, but I actually did major in audio recording, so this is quite a thrill to be able to talk to you. It's really cool. Yeah, Dr. Rogers, or should I call you Susan? I don't want to presume.
Oh, Susan, yeah. Susan's great.
It's wonderful to meet you, and I want to thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
I know it's valuable, and it means a lot to be able to talk to you.
It's a real pleasure to talk with you guys. It's a pleasure to talk about the ladies, whom I love so much, and just talk about the days in the studio. That's a really happy memory for me. Good times.
I can only imagine. Yeah.
Well, and of course, we love the ladies here. So it's a pleasure for us to be able to talk to someone who's had such a intricate relationship with them and worked so deeply with them. So it's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I better start with a correction. You mentioned that I teach music theory, but I don't teach music theory because I'm a non-musician. I don't know music theory. I can find middle C on a piano, and I can, if I do the FACE or the every good boy deserves fudge. I can read music notation. No, what I teach is record production and recording engineering. I also teach music cognition and psychoacoustics at Berklee, but I leave the music to the kids.
Well, it's funny. I was going to say, Susan, Tracy's heard me talk about psychoacoustics several times already on the show. So, like, when I heard that you were involved with cognition and the psychology behind audio, I was really, really super excited to talk to you about that, because that's something that's always fascinated me, just how much of music and sound happens in our minds, not our ears, is terribly fascinating.
Absolutely right. If I had only known that when I was in the business, if I had only known how the path from the ear up to the cortex changes what we hear, I don't know that I would have been able to do my job any better, because naturally when we're making records, we're making a musical object, not thinking about theory, and we're not thinking about how to make it perfect. We're thinking on a deeper level. But nonetheless, there were some things that I knew how to do by practice, and I think most engineers do, but now I know what I was doing. Now that I have that education, I know what I was doing. That's kind of cool. For example, I was just talking with students this afternoon about that. So the brain compares the signal from the left and right ears to look at the timing of the signal, and it compares to look at the phase of the signal reaching the two ears and to look at the level differences. So when I worked in the studio, if I was mixing, I really liked to take a bass and make it perceptually just a little bit wider, because it was pleasing to me. But so what you do is you have to take the bass and you have to copy it, or electronically make a copy of it. We could do that easily now with digital workstations. In the analog days, you have to patch it, right? So you got the two identical basses, but you take your second bass, let's say it's the one that's panned slightly right, and you delay it by just a millisecond or two, and that's going to shift the stereo image over to the left, unless you compensate by raising up that level, and then it's going to pull the stereo image a little closer to the right. So what you end up getting is a slightly wider than normal bass. And those sorts of tricks become the sonic signatures of audio engineers and mixers, just like every director is going to have those visual signatures, or cinematographer will have those signatures. This is what their films look like. Likewise, for record makers, we got a thing that we like, and this is what our records sound like. That's a cool notion, the notion of us record makers forming these internal templates for what good is, and then just like a chef would in the kitchen, just satisfy your own taste.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I completely agree. This is something I've witnessed myself doing when I reflect upon it, as well as other people I know who work in the studio. You just kind of develop your own rhythm and your own kind of little idiosyncrasies, and you can kind of tell, I think that was probably mixed by Aaron, because he tends to have his highs a little crispier or whatever. So I think now, in preparation for this interview, I wish I had had more time, Susan, but I did watch a few interviews with you. You were at the Loop Music Festival by Ableton. You gave a wonderful talk that I really, really enjoyed. And I read a couple interviews as well, and I read, I can't recall where it was, but you were talking about having worked with Prince and how particular he was, like taking the mids out of the bass drum and things like that, that you feel like his flavor was sort of like indelibly mixed onto yours for a while after that. It was just so strong, you know what I mean? Can you talk a little bit about like what it was like working with him?
Oh, yeah, I could talk for weeks about what it was like working with him, for sure. It's important that the listeners recognize that Prince was no mere mortal.
That's so true.
His output of how prolific he was as a writer, in terms of the breadth of his talent, both the breadth and the depth. So he could play drums in a way that would just make your jaw drop, not just play them acoustically, but program a drum machine. He was a genius with rhythm. But then he'd move from that instrument over to bass, and he'd just be killing you. He'd just be killing you. And remember, we worked during the days of analog tape, so there's no micro editing there. There's no pitch correcting. There's no timing correcting. What you hear on those records is it's a guy with an instrument in his hands. And it was usually one take. If we stopped, it was typically because he changed his mind about a part, not because he made a mistake. It was ridiculously good. And then he'd move from that instrument to keys and to guitar and be just as good there. And then he'd get on vocals. Just as good. And you'd be thinking, how can this one person be this deeply, deeply skilled? The short answer to that, which is an incomplete answer, the short answer is that as a teenager, he spent a lot of time alone. He spent a lot of time alone with instruments and teaching himself to play to this degree. I pause and I hesitate a little bit because part of his teenage years were really sad and really lonely. I've heard stories, both firsthand and secondhand, of him being abused by his stepfather, being locked in a bedroom, and locked in a bedroom for a week at a time, where the kid would he'd have nothing other than his instruments, and so from that great pressure, you know how pressure forms a diamond. From that great pressure, a diamond was formed, and when he did achieve escape velocity and was able to break out of that home life and was able to get a record deal as a teenager. I think he might have been 18 or 19. Once you escape, that pressure launches you really far into your career. And in the time when I was with him, he did not stop. I know he slowed down like any human being would a little bit later on, but he had a very fast, very high trajectory for a very long time.
Yeah, I just get chills thinking about him just laying down a drum track in one take, and then moving along, picking up the bass, and just putting the groove down, and just putting that down, and then going on the guitar. Like, obviously, a lot of records these days are made like that, but in many, many, many takes, punching in, picking up from wherever halfway through the solo, over hours and hours of times. And I can only imagine just watching this guy just going from one to another like a marathon, and just jamming it right out. That had to give you goosebumps.
To watch him, you might assume that he had no self-doubt because he worked so quickly. And you would be wrong if you assumed that. What he had was the capacity to hear arrangements in his head as he was writing a song, in the case of like dance music, or after he had written a song. So he would write ballads, and some of his more important songs he wrote and then brought to the studio. Wrote them on piano, came up with the melody, the expression, came up with the lyrics, brought them into the studio, and seemed to understand exactly how all the parts would go, because he would take his lyric sheet and pin it up on a mic stand or something in front of the drum kit, and without wearing headphones, because he's not playing to anything, he would play the song top to bottom on an acoustic drum kit.
Wow.
Fills, the breaks, play the entire part top to bottom, only listening to himself play it with the song in his head, the tempo and everything, the changes, the breaks, everything. And then he could come into the control room and lay down the bass part and gradually build the song up. That's why I said no mere mortal does that.
No, he was definitively a musical genius.
Oh, yeah.
He truly was. And the other way he would sometimes work is, especially if it was dance music, is just program a drum machine with a beat that he liked and then figure out what the chord change was going to be. So he'd be composing as recording. And figuring out what changes he wanted. As I recall, he was usually in a slightly better mood when he was doing that, because that was him just fooling around. That was the stuff that came out of him so easily. The songs that were more complex, or that ended up being his bigger hits, that took more concentrated effort, were the things that took a little bit longer in the studio. By a little bit longer, I mean like a day and a half or 2 days, as opposed to 1 day.
Oh, my goodness.
When I say 1 day, I mean from the downbeat to the final mix.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's incredible.
And
It's incredible.
So taking that, like, he imprinted upon you, much like ducks and small